We're going to begin with a defense of poetry by Percy B. Shelley, and this is in your syllabus prescribed right after Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads in 1800. Now this essay was written in 1821, but it was first published posthumously, that is after his death in 1840. That was by one of the famous publishers in London, Edwin Moxon, and he got this published in the Essays, Letters from Abroad, Translations and Fragment. Now before looking through the official context in which Shelley came out with his defense of poetry. Defense, because if it's a defense of poetry or if it's a defense of anything else, that means it is against someone's definite accusation over something. So before dwelling more onto that this essay was a response to someone else's accusation, formal official accusation, let's first dwell a bit more on the definite context in which these poets, these writers were writing, that is the Romantic Age. Now this category of romantic authors, writers working in the period from 1785 to 1832 onwards, they did not really think of themselves as constituting a group called romantics. It was a later Victorian critics who first wrote of these previous generation as the romantic ones, or they were the ones who promoted this description. They were the one who promoted this term or the description for the period of that writing called the romantic authors. And I've also mentioned earlier that these independent individuals, they were clubbed under, they was grouped together, or they were seen as independent individuals under various schools of thought. So there was this Lake school, there was this Cockney school, there was this Satanic school, and there was even for the women writing in those times, for example, the very famous essay of Mary Wollstonecraft and her followers. They were branded as Amazonian band, or those other women writers, they were regarded as unsexed females. So clearly there was this proliferation of various schools of thought which suggested that certain fault lines were running through, certain lacunae appeared through this fractious literary world. And why that happened? Because Romanticism was not a very cohesive, a close-knit kind of thought that was prevalent during those times. It wasn't emerging itself as an ideology in itself. It was later on branded by the Victorian critics, looking back at the previous generation as such. And this era's most talented men, they gravitated towards, they moved towards, they supported or they wrote various pieces of poetry in particular. And why? When they gravitated towards poetry, they somewhere confirmed poetry's elevated cultural status. And these were the ones, some of them even abandoned their other careers. For example, Coleridge was a minister, Sir Walter Scott was studying law, and Keats was practicing medicine. George Canning, an important figure, literary figure, he was a Tory leader in Britain's House of Commons. So writing poetry was somewhere one of the most eccentric feature of this entire culture. This culture of this period of 1785 to 1832, they were simply mad for poetry, to the extent that poetry penetrated in their everyday lives. Poetry went through their everyday lives. There was something that was appearing in daily newspapers, alongside news stories, notices, deaths and marriages, and that was something which was meant to be memorized, which was meant to be sung, transcribed into commonplace books among common folks, right? And why this happened? This happened because the calling of becoming a poet, or the fact that many tried their hands at becoming the author, or they imagined that verse writing, or VERSE, poetry writing, might act as, or might provide them with a kind of springboard to fame. This proliferation of people selecting this as to be their primary profession, or becoming authors and poets, this definitely generated a backlash. Because although it was true that there was an increase in number of readers, it was true that all new sorts of people starting or became the part of the reading public. It was true that with the mass production of new books, new publishing houses, popular press, there was this multiplication of new venues for their writings, for these people to enlist themselves as authors. But at the same time, this backlash was because there was this clear debasement of artistic standards, of the poetic artistic standards that happened. So the genuine poet, or the genius poet which was there, he was somewhere shadowed throughout the Romantic period by someone who was acting as, or who was more like a pseudo poet, and that somewhere gave a kind of misguided romantic scribbler image. That is why when we see these confident declarations by Wordsworth in different times, say first in 1798 and then in preface 1800 and then 1802, or when Shelley was writing the defense of poetry, these confident declarations emerge as a kind of answer, as a kind of defense in itself to the general degeneration, to the general debasement of the artistic standards or general decadence that has came up in the poetic aesthetics of those times. It is in this definitive context that we see that Thomas Love Peacock, he published an article in Literary Miscellany, and that article was The Four Ages of Poetry. Now this was a very boisterous satire on the entire role and purpose of poetry, of its irrelevance, and it is more like an amusing essay, but it argues that poetry belongs to nothing but properly primitive societies, and that poetry has nothing civilizational or nothing important to contribute. So these four ages of poetry, or so-called four stages of poetry, Thomas Love Peacock here mentions that poetry passes through four distinct ages, that is almost comparable to the four ages of a man. Now these age are just as we had, human civilization has experienced the Iron Age. So the age of iron is where everything is crude, untutored, unfurnished, or in its primitive stages, right? So Thomas Peacock says that the medieval folk ballads and the medieval folk romances, the period of primitivism, this was all something, the poetry was in its infancy, and that's why we can regard it in the age of iron. Then next came the age of gold. Now gold is something which reflects, which is known for its ingenuity, which is known for its being different from the other core elements. So this age of gold in poetry meant when natural genius was in its full bloom, saw its complete manifestation. So this period of epics and tragic forms of the of Athens and Greek and the Renaissance Europe, they all were the ages of gold, that is the youth, right? And then if you compare it with the age of man, that was the age of youth. Then comes the age of silver. Now the age of silver was seen more like a luxuriant growth of imagination, but that was at the same time working within the functions or within the prerogative of rules. So the period of Virgil and Dryden and Pope, not period of Virgil, but when these translations of Virgil and other great poets, Homer, were taking place, or in other words, the neoclassical period. So this neoclassical period, he called it as the age of silver, the periods of Dryden and Pope. That is the middle age. Now finally came the old age of a man, that is the age of bronze, in which poetry, it returns to its artificiality, it returns to its simplicity, it returns to its almost like a second childhood. Now old age is also regarded as a kind of second childhood. So poetry returned to its second childhood, that is of extreme old age. That is when classical period declined and the age of Wordsworth, Scott, Byron and others came up. So in a way he was criticizing, boisterously satirizing the age of Wordsworth, Scott, Byron and these poets. And this, Peacock says, whenever civilizations advances, poetry has nothing major to contribute. Poetry declines, and poetry declines until its pursuit becomes nothing but a waste of time. So it's a waste of time for any youth who should be idly busy with busy in the study of natural sciences, in the study of social sciences, or any intelligent and enlightened being should be indulged in these natural and social sciences or rationalistic purpose of life. For them, poetry at this stage comes where it becomes a waste of time. Now this essay is something, or these statements, these were, although the part of a satire that he wrote, very satirically he wrote. Now this something excited Shelley so much that he called it a kind of a sacred rage, a kind of pious anger that came out as a kind of retortment to Peacock's letter. And that is why, as a reply, he wrote this brilliant treatise called A Defense of Poetry in 1821. Although it never became a sort of continuous polemical notion, because it was published in 1821, it was written in 1821 but published posthumously in 1840s. But Peacock, in his presumption, who had resorted more towards reason and enlightenment and called poetry as primitive and nothing but superstitious or nothing major to contribute to the civilization, this is against which Shelley rose, and he in several letters to Peacock himself, he described it as a sort of hearsay, as a kind of censure upon a kind of condemnation of whatever views Peacock has presented. So before we proceed further with the textual reading, let's quickly have a brief overview of Shelley's life, that is his biographical life. Shelley, who was born in 1792, belonged to an aristocratic family. He was a son of a baronet of Sussex, and he was educated at Oxford and Eton. And at Oxford, during his studies, he was expelled from the university because he published a controversial pamphlet. The controversial pamphlet was called The Necessity of Atheism. So, with the pamphlet itself, you can establish that his views on atheism, the fact that he did not believe in God and had his own mistrust, his own distrust upon certain social institutions soon, led to his reputation throughout life. And because of this distrust in some social institutions, the value systems, the ethical paradigms of these value systems, the religious system, the moral and religious systems and doctrines that usually guide human lives in a given society, in a given civilization. So this distrust caused him a major dent upon his outside reputation, his social reputation, but he was established with the help of his company with Lord Byron. He was quite a well-known literary and poetic figure of the Romantic age. His personal life was also quite unsteady and irresponsible. He initially eloped with a woman called Harriet Westbrook. She was the daughter of a coffee house owner, and he married her at Edinburgh. But later on, because he was a minor and he was also expelled from the university, and it was also regarded that he married a woman quite below his rank. So this kind of alienated him from the family, from his own education, and for three years they both led the life of a vagrant. They had a wandering life. They were engaged in some sort of reformation or some sort of propaganda in Ireland and Wales, but more or less it wasn't a very stable kind of life. And in 1813 again, he started printing privately for just the circulation among friends, and he was quite young when he first published his Queen Mab, one of the important notable work of P.B. Shelley. Fortunately or unfortunately, after that he had a love affair with the school mistress, and for this reason he left his first wife Harriet Westbrook, and he eloped with Mary Godwin, that was the school mistress. And Mary Godwin, the very famous daughter of the anarchical philosopher William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. And this one reason became the cause after which it was believed that Harriet Westbrook could not take this well, and after that she committed suicide. And Shelley, he married Mary Godwin after Harriet's suicide in 1816. But when he returned, Harriet's father had filed a criminal suit against Shelley, and as a result of the suit, he was deprived of the custody of his children from the first wife. Well, this is not very important, but this was again the time when he returned to his native land and published his first great poem, The Alaster, or simply The Alaster, 1816, and Revolt of Islam, 1817. His private life generated much hostility among the public, and this conduct of his own life and the opinion that drove around him, people were quite against, the public was quite against this move, the fact that Harriet has committed suicide, coupled with his rebellious views on the political life during those times and his opinions on it. So these both factors were important, which drove him ultimately abroad to Italy in 1818, and he spent the remaining part of it 4 years of his life at living at Venice, Rome, Pisa, Naples. And just as Byron, Shelley produced some of his greatest works during these years of exile, during these years of solitude in Italy. His Prometheus Unbound, that was a lyrical drama, and then Hellas, again a lyrical drama, then the Cenci, a tragedy, a love poem on the as an elegy on the death of Keats, then Adonais and the great nature lyrics, the Ode to the West Wind, the Cloud, to a Skylark, These poems, by which he is known as a prominent romantic figure today, these poems were written during his time of exile, during his time of solitude at Italy. And he left behind quite a huge number of poems behind him when he finally died in the year 1822.